I Barely Got Here is a collection of stories and conversations based on 24 years in law enforcement. You have the right to be disturbed by some of the content or disagree with the viewpoints. Anything you hear can and will be dosed with sarcasm and dark humor. You have the right to know that discussions will often be graphic with language and themes that are intended for a mature audience. Do you understand your rights? Then buckle up, Buttercup. We're going 10-8. Hello, and welcome back to I Barely Got Here. I'm your host, Kevin Buncher. And hey, I've got Jay in here with me again, and I'm just continuing my plan to pick his brain dry of all his great stories and experiences and everything. So, Jay, you want to say hello?
Hello, Kevin.
Thanks for being back with me again.
Thanks for having me back.
So, today we're going to do something that I think is going to be really interesting. We're actually going to go back a little bit on an investigation, a major investigation that Jay primarily was involved with. Again, I was kind of on the periphery of this one, but it involves the Hells Angels. And, you know, there's a lot of controversy with the Hells Angels and what they're about and what they do and everything else. And we kind of decided that when we were talking this out that we don't really want to get into them specifically as the organization because we have a story to tell about certain members that were part of that club. So really, the only thing that we want to say is that, you know, the Hells Angels have been designated as a criminal syndicate, and that's accurate. Anything to add, Jay?
Nothing more to add.
Perfect. And I think that's where we're going to let that sit. You know, if anybody has any questions or whatever, again, I'll give you an email and things like that. But I think we want to focus specifically on this case that Jay's going to discuss because it's a very interesting and it's a tragic story. So without further ado, tonight's episode is Drop Off. So, Jay, you want to kind of start us off on this one?
Sure. This one was an incident that occurred or was brought to my attention shortly after I retired from law enforcement. I had retired after my 20-year career, and it was a year or two after I'd retired. Our dispatcher, Tempe PD Dispatch, called me, which is very unusual to receive a call from dispatch.
Yeah.
They were telling me that somebody had been getting hold of the police department, and it might not have been dispatch, but it was somebody from the police department telling me that an individual had been repeatedly contacting the Tempe Police Department trying to get in touch with me. It was very important. And this individual was so persistent that he refused to take no for an answer. And yet they certainly wouldn't give them my contact information. They were concerned for my safety, but he was becoming a bit of a pain in the butt to them. So they were hoping that I would return his call and see what it was he wanted so they could get cut out of the equation.
Right. You know, Jay touched on, you'll get people that call into dispatch or records or whatever that say, hey, I want to talk to Officer so-and-so or Sergeant so-and-so. And oftentimes it's kind of a nutty deal or it doesn't really ring true. But especially when you're retired, that's exactly it. That nobody calls for you anymore. I mean, you're out of the business. You're done. It was probably strange. And it's part of, wouldn't you agree, that's probably part of the reason that they called you because it's a rarity one and the guy just wouldn't take no for an answer.
Both. You're correct on both.
Yeah. So it is kind of rare. So you get the information and do what?
Yeah, I get the information. I get the guy's name, and it was a name I was familiar with. His name was Mike Kramer. I knew Mike for maybe 10 years before I received this request to call him back. He was a member of a outlaw motorcycle gang that we had in the state of Arizona called the Dirty Dozen, and he eventually became a member of the Hells Angels. So for whatever reason, Mike wanted to get a hold of me and have a conversation. So I called him back, and he was very insistent. He had to talk to me about something, would not talk to me over the telephone about it, was extremely scared, jumpy, nervous, evasive. He piqued my interest enough to go have a discussion with him, go meet with him.
Okay.
Unlike previous occasions whenever I met with Mike, and I should say my relationship began with Mike when he owned a motorcycle shop in our city. He had customers coming in trying to get him to buy stolen motorcycles, and he was concerned about this, having been in and out of prison before. He didn't want to go back to prison, so eventually he came to my attention through a beat cop who thought it would be good if he and I knew one another. I was working an undercover assignment back then that dealt with property-related crimes. So I met with Mike. I began to understand his issues, his problems. And so I started buying stolen motorcycle parts and motorcycles from customers that came in. He would just pass along my name and number to these people. And then I don't ever remember even paying Mike for the information. I think it was just his way of staying in good graces with law enforcement, since the Outlaw Motorcycle Gang brings on a lot of law enforcement attention.
Right. So you're saying at that time he was with Dirty Dozen?
He was.
Okay. So obviously you see a bit of a conflict issue there. So I'm sure that he was trying to keep all that on the lowdown without his club finding out about that.
Oh, he was. Yeah. Right. What he was doing was completely out of bounds. He should not have been talking to me about this.
Right.
And he should not have been informing and being a snitch. Yeah. So he was very cautious of that. And I was very cognizant of the fact that if the organization found out about our relationship, it would be detrimental to his health and his life.
Sure. To be honest, and we'll talk about it in a second, but this relationship that you established with this guy obviously carried forward, and for him to have that kind of trust in you, because again, you get a guy that's a CI working for you like that, there's some trust involved, and especially when a guy like that has a lot to lose if he's found out. So obviously he trusted you.
He did. Yeah. He trusted me completely.
Yeah.
And I think I was probably one of the only members of law enforcement he ever had a normal conversation with. I treated him like he hadn't been to prison or he hadn't been in this outlaw motorcycle gang. I mean, I just treated him like an individual, and I worked him. He gave me information. It was a symbiotic relationship to some degree. We didn't have dinner with one another, but I treated him with respect. Right.
You had that prior experience with him. You're unloading stolen motorcycle parts from people that come into a shop, et cetera. So that kind of played itself out, essentially, that investigation.
It did.
And then you continued contact? Or
I didn't. There were a number of years we were absent from one another, and I didn't check in on him. He just stopped calling. And then near the end of my law enforcement career, I received a phone call from him requesting to meet me, for lunch. He needed to get together with me. And by this time, the transition from the Dirty Dozen to the Hells Angels had occurred. The Hells Angels had come to the state of Arizona and absorbed.
Taken over.
Certain members, not all members of the Hells Angels. I knew that Mike wanted to be at AJ. He always respected the status of being a Hells Angel and wanted to be a member of the Hells Angel. And for whatever reason, he wanted to get together with me and meet me at a place in Phoenix to have a conversation with me.
He didn't tell you anything what it was about? Or?
He didn't. He was not terribly evasive. I need to get together with you. I need to talk to you. I want to chat with you.
Sure.
And by this time, having not had a relationship with him for so many years, I brought it to the attention of some officers or some detectives, some gang guys that had more involvement with the Hells Angels than I did. I was working narcotics at the time, not any gang activity, and they were extremely concerned about his reach out to me to get together with me. So their assessment was, they said a couple of reasons that guys do this that are members of the Hells Angels. They're either trying to twist you, they have some sort of dirt on you, they're trying to twist you for some cooperation, or, they're setting you up for something down the road to hurt you.
Sure. So obviously, that would be a concern.
Yeah. So I eventually hooked up with some guys from our state task force, DPS, and they wired me up with some body bugs and went and had a hamburger with this guy with 10 guys in the back of the restaurant ready to storm in and about a half dozen out front, just making sure nothing bad happened to me.
What was your mindset? Obviously you had lost contact with the guy for a while. You'd had a good relationship with him, but what's your mindset? Are you as concerned as they are? Or are you kind of thinking, well, because you're not dumb. Jay's a smart cop. So I'm sure you're kind of like, okay, I see the concern. However, what was your thought?
I was cautious, but not as concerned as everybody else around me was.
Okay.
I felt we had a very good relationship back in the day. I had never done anything in my work that brought hardship back to his business, either through law enforcement or the Dirty Dozen, So I had never revealed to the world who he was.
You'd done him right.
And I did. I treated him fair. And I told the guys I figured he just wanted to show me his new leather jacket and just tell me about his family.
Sure.
I didn't read more into it than that. I thought it was a pretty innocuous, pretty innocent request to reconnect.
Okay.
The guy, I don't think had any friends, and later it turned out he really didn't have anybody he really trusted, I had a relationship with.
That That's a funny point that you bring up there, because I think how many times I can think of a couple in my career that rings true with people, that the people that you would least expect to glom onto you and divulge their secrets, it's because they just don't really have anyone else in their life they trust.
They don't.
And so you find this, basically, you're a handler. You're a CI handler is what you are. But they develop that relationship with you. And oftentimes it's much more one-sided. The CI feels like there's a much more of a relationship and a personal relationship than the cop does.
To this day, I still have relationships like that with people that I've known for decades.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? So, again, another example. That's what you got here. Basically, this guy's. He trusts you and he wants to meet up, and for whatever purpose.
Right. And so we met up, and it was a pleasant lunch. He shared with me the process that he went from the Dirty Dozen over to the Hells Angels, discussed with me the inner workings of the Hells Angels as much as we could over a burger and a beer. He was in, I think they call it the prospect stage or the pledge stage, where he was much like a fraternity, having to do the grunt work for other longer-term tenured members of the organization, which be get parts for them, clean their motorcycle, do stupid stuff that to an adult man, that's not in the business. That business seems somewhat demeaning, but that is the rite of passage that they have to go through in order to become a full member of the organization.
Yeah, patched in. Yeah, and it's, when you're in that prospect phase, it's just like Jay said, they literally can have you do anything. I mean, we've heard stories of, lay on the floor and we're all going to pee on you. I mean, it's just stupid as stuff like that as well. But again, it's that process they go through, because that patch means more to them than anything.
It does.
Yeah. So you meet with the guy and he's kind of giving you this, and does it ever go any different direction?
No, it didn't. Other than the gang guys that were familiar with the Hells Angels were listening to what I was talking about. And I still remember receiving texts from them while I was at lunch with Mike. And at one point I even had to call my wife, which was a DPS officer, and they asked me, hey, ask him this, ask him this. So they were steering some questions where they felt they had an opportunity maybe to gather some intel that they normally wouldn't have. So
they want you to pump this guy for info, because again, it's a rarity. HA anything, prospect, outlaw criminals don't reach out to cops and hang out and have a burger and tell them about the inner workings of their organization.
It was a unique opportunity.
Yeah, very.
And so we wrapped up lunch, went back, debriefed. Everybody knew what I had just gone through because they were listening to me. And then I do remember a couple other occasions that I would actually go to Mike's house and have conversations with him just to kind of gather more information about that DPS wanted or the gang guys wanted. And then he drifted away, and I went into retirement.
Right. Okay.
So when Mike reached back out to me, I knew for a fact he would, by this time, would have been a full member of the Hells Angels, and I was no longer a police in law enforcement, and felt somewhat concerned about this meeting not having, 12, 16 officers in the parking lot.
Sure. So from the time, let's just say, of your last experience with Mike when you're working to when he reached back out to you, are we talking years? Are we talking months?
No, we're talking 2 or 3 years.
Okay, so substantial amount of time.
Some time advanced.
Yeah, and at this point you're doing PI work and some other things.
I am.
So, okay, so he reaches out to you.
He did.
You have the concern. Obviously, I would have the same.
Yeah, but I had the concern, but PI work is very isolating, very lonely. So part of me wanted the contact again. I was curious to find out what it was he wanted to share with me.
Sure.
But not so curious that I wouldn't at least let a buddy know where I was going to be. So I called a buddy of ours, Dale. Mm-hmm. Said, Dale, I'm going to be at Denny's at this location. I'm meeting this guy. And if I don't come home and my wife comes looking for me, at least you'll have a starting point to try to recreate where I ended up.
And his response was?
He giggled and told me I shouldn't go to the meeting.
Right.
And I hung up and drove to Denny's and went to the meeting. Like any curious
I would have gone.
Individual.
I would have gone. Yeah. I'm with you.
So I met with Mike at the restaurant again, and he looked older and more weathered and very emotionally distraught, and danced around a issue that seemed to be bothering him, but he would never come out and tell me what the big issue was. But he did let me know. He goes, I may have to come out. He goes, I may have to leave the HA, the Hells Angels. And he goes, I would like to, I'm talking to you to see if you might help me with an exit strategy and a way out, because I have some information that is so concerning to me, and I don't know what to do with it. And I said, I can't help you unless I know what you're telling me unless I know really what the issue is.
Right. And just for, informational purposes, you don't just walk out of the HA. It's not like you just say, hey, I'm done, I'm going to leave. There's a process you have to go through. And quite frankly, as soon as someone tries to do that, the club is immediately suspicious because that's just wrong. These guys have basically given up and done anything to get that patch and get into the club, so they don't leave. They never leave. Yeah, so just the fact that he even mentions that to you had to make you start thinking, wow, this got to be something.
Right, and that's a good point because leaving is harder, I think, sometimes than gaining admittance into the club.
Yeah.
And there's much more consequences on your way out because you have a database of wrongdoings for as long as you have been in the organization, and members that are still there are concerned about what you take away.
Right.
And what you may reveal to somebody someday. So,
right.
So the process is not a fun process.
Right. And it's never, it's never a simple one. But
right.
So obviously, as soon as he says that, obviously, the spider sense has got to be tingling a little bit like, ooh, this is probably something pretty juicy.
Oh, yeah, I was convinced it was something really juicy. I left the restaurant not knowing what it was.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, no, he didn't divulge to me. So we went through several telephone conversations similar to what we experienced at Denny's. And I think I might have even met him back at his house, one or two more times to a point where, my curiosity was killing me, and he was like incrementally giving me a little bit more information that would lead me to believe that it might involve a murder.
It sounds like a really long, drawn-out interview. Is what it sounds like. Like when you're interviewing that suspect or something.
Right. No, instead of hours, it was like weeks.
Yeah,
It was like it was just a snail's pace. And,
oh my God.
And I couldn't set it aside either because I needed to know what it was. I'm a curious by nature, and I've missed that life and feeling like I had doing something important.
Right.
And, now that I thought it was a murder, I felt compelled to push this thing as far as I could to, find out what had happened. Eventually, we reached a point where I was convinced it involved a murder. So when I came to that realization, I reached out to some gang guy sergeants in Tempe, my old department, and had a conversation with them. You have a lot of restaurant conversations as a cop. So this one, again, was in another restaurant with the sergeant and a gang guy, where I explained, much like what you and I have just discussed in our podcast, in your podcast here, of my relationship with Mike. And then he brought in somebody from ATF. And he really, really felt that this case was bigger than what his unit could handle. He wanted to bring in a federal organization because it's so rare that, somebody from the HA walks in and wants to, cooperate.
Oh, it's unheard of.
It is.
It's unheard of.
It is. So ultimately, I had a couple of conversations with an ATF agent out of California. And I think that went on for a week or so until we finally reached a point where the ATF agent was going to fly in from I think Los Angeles, and the gang guys I was talking to, we're going to get a hotel. Mike had finally agreed to meet with the gang guys and the ATF agent as long as I was with him, and meet with him at some clandestine hotel somewhere in the valley. And that meeting was arranged. And so I told the ATF agent and then the gang guys before the meeting that I still didn't know what it was, but I was tired of not knowing what we were dealing with. So Mike Kramer was a big Budweiser drinker. So I suggested that they might have a case of Budweiser at the hotel when we got there. I
loosen the tongue a little bit?
Loosen the tongue. I went over and picked Mike up from his home, and I drove him to a meeting with 3 cops.
Wow.
And so began another conversation.
So when you pick this guy up, again, are you having any reservations? Are you having any thoughts at this point? Are you pretty confident that he's going to divulge and finally give up the ghost here?
I was really confident at that point he was, and I was feeling less and less comfortable about my position in this situation the longer it went on. I didn't want to become a material witness to something, a murder, a confession. What started out to be fun curiosity now was like I was so flippin' tired of this conversation. I was ready to get to the end and then leave, pass the baton to somebody else.
Yeah, I was just going to say pass the baton back out.
I was ready. I was kind of over it by this point, but I didn't want to leave and abandon him because I never would have got to Mike and nobody would have ever got the answer. So, So I think we even had a beer or two on the way to the hotel and went in, and we had to do a bunch of crazy turning around because Mike was concerned about being followed by anybody.
Yeah.
And so once he was comfortable that nobody was following us, and I took him to the room, went in, he was terrified, and I began to introduce him and be kind of the, I don't know what you call it.
I keep thinking the security blanket. I mean, you're Mike's security blanket at that point.
I was, but I was more the matchmaker here. I mean, I was really good. I wanted them to fall in love and begin a beautiful relationship, and I wanted to go home.
And then, you get out of the middle.
Yeah, I wanted to get out of the middle. So we had about 3 hours in the hotel with the same discussion I'd been having with Mike for 2 or 3 weeks, and he never would reveal.
Oh my! I was going to ask you that, but so. Okay, so you've already answered that question that he didn't reveal. So do you feel like that's because of these guys that were working with you? Were they we know that when you do interviews and things, some people do interviews well and some people don't do interviews so well. Do you feel like they approached it in the proper way, or do you think they approached it and almost stifled them?
I think they approached it in the proper way, but he didn't have a relationship with those 3 guys that he had with me for 10 years.
Okay.
So, but I couldn't convince him to say the words that needed to be said in their presence. You know, there was still that reluctance, and I don't know if he was hanging on to their law enforcement. I don't think he ever viewed me as law enforcement. Even when I was a cop, I was like his buddy,
right.
You know, and for some reason. So he just couldn't bring himself to say the words, even though I would hypothetically say the words for him. Say, you know, Mr. ATF agent, you know, let's say Mike was witness to or participated in or was part of the worst crime you could ever think of, a murder. Is that something ATF would ignore and allow him to come in and cooperate for a reduction of sentence or an exit strategy from the club? And they were doing all the head nodding and assuring that one would do.
Right.
But Mike he just couldn't commit to it. So, we left after trying to close the deal for probably 3 or 4 hours.
Holy crap. That's a long meeting to not get it out.
Exhausting.
So you what? How's the car ride home with Mike? Are you kind of like, what the hell, Mike?
Well, yeah, but I didn't use hell. I mean, I was like,
I can't imagine.
WTF.
Yeah, sure.
So, no, I was frustrated, angry about everything that I had gone through for this guy and law enforcement too. You know,
sure.
They had invested considerable resources at this point just to get an audience with this guy. So I drove him back to his place, kind of chewing his ass, you know, the whole way back.
Yeah.
You know, I can't do this for you. You have to do it yourself. And you took the time. I was shaming him, and whatever you're dealing with is bothering you enough to continue this dialogue and reach out to me to begin with. So I don't know how to help you, but I'm done. You know, I'm firing you. You know, we're done here.
Right.
So when I got to his house, he asked me if I'd come into his garage and have another beer with him. So I went into the garage to have one more parting beer with Mike, and at that point, he told me what was bothering him.
Finally gives it up.
Finally gave it up.
So let's hear it. What's he say?
Finally gave it up. He told me that I think probably weeks or a month, just several days before his initial reach out to the police department to try to connect with me, he was at the Mesa clubhouse for the Hells Angels, and they had tasked out some pledges or prospects to go out and bring a woman back to the clubhouse for him. You know, kind of gave them that fraternity assignment to go find somebody and bring him back. And they went out and they actually did bring back a woman for whatever, to hang out with them at the club. She was drinking with them at the club and apparently had disrespected somebody in the club, and somebody had knocked her to the ground, punched her, teaching her a lesson, and knocked her down to the ground to teach her some respect. You know, respect us in our own house.
Right. You know, it sounds pretty extreme, but, you know, again, that mentality, that whole HA mentality. And I guess you could say the same thing for a number of other clubs or organizations or whatever, typically criminal. But, you know, you disrespect or respect is a huge, huge issue, right? So huge. The HA, whatever they did, I mean, it could be something as simple as basically a comment about their jacket. I mean, just something about the club or the club itself or a member or whatever. And they don't view it. You can't do it. Especially not in their home. You know, I mean, that's their clubhouse. It's the place that they consider, you know, sacred and blah, blah, blah. So I don't recall what the woman said either, but I mean, it could have been the most offhand thing that you would never even suspect anyway.
You're right, Kevin. I mean, it could have been so mundane. It would mean nothing to us or whoever's listening to us having this conversation with one another now. And I don't even recall Mike telling me what was said. Just the words were exchanged, and they took offense, and they knocked her to the ground. Teach her some manners. She got back up and started drinking, and the more she drank, the less respectful she became, and the more vocal she became. And they knocked her to the ground again.
So, and I think, again, from remembering parts of the case, this gal was pretty much... She stood up for herself.
She did.
She wasn't, I don't even want to say typical, but I mean, she wasn't, you take someone, if you get punched and knocked to the ground, it kind of changes your mindset like, ooh, I'm not going to do that again. But she was pretty headstrong and I'm not saying that in a bad way by any means, but it's more of she was standing up for herself. She wasn't letting these guys walk on her, basically.
She was a tough, hard, streetwise woman.
There you go.
Wouldn't take crap from anybody, and it was a bad combination that night in their house.
Yeah.
So they knocked her to the ground again and ultimately knocked her unconscious, and I think they even kicked her when she was down on the ground. And so now they're left with an unconscious woman on the floor of the Mesa chapter of the Hells Angels, their clubhouse. So the decision was made again with the gentleman I won't even say gentleman, with the men that had went out to find this woman and bring her back. They were going to load her up in a car and take her off and drop her off somewhere. So Cynthia is her name. She was removed unconsciously from the floor of the Mesa clubhouse and stuffed into the trunk of a Grand Am, two-door Pontiac Grand Am with the spare tire in the trunk as they squeezed her in there and driven out to the desert outside of Mesa, Arizona.
So when you say drop-off, what does a drop-off mean to the HA?
Well, I didn't know it at the time, but Mike explained it to me later. In prior situations or similar situations, it's not uncommon for the Hells Angels to take somebody, take them a long ways out town, strip them naked, and make them walk back, kind of a walk of shame from the desert to teach them a lesson.
So that'd be a drop-off.
A drop-off.
Got it.
That would be the drop-off.
So that's what he assumed was going to occur with Cynthia.
The same thing. Yeah, that's exactly what he thought was going to occur. So they drove her out to the desert, got her out of the trunk of the car, actually lifted her over some barbed wire, took her out maybe 20, 30 feet into the desert. And Mike then told me that he turned around to return back to the car when he heard a noise coming from the area of where they had just deposited this woman. And he observed one of these prospects standing over the top of her with a knife held in both hands, plunging it into her chest repeatedly.
Wow.
So he stood there in shock, feet away from this woman that he thought was going to be just left there to return somehow to Phoenix or to civilization, because she wasn't that far out of town. She was maybe only 4 or 5 miles out of the urban area. And then the man that was stabbing her first gave the knife to somebody else, the second guy in the group, and he assumed the same position and kept stabbing Cynthia in the chest. And then when he was done stabbing her, they passed the knife to Mike and instructed Mike to cut her head off. And he knelt over her and put the knife to her throat and proceeded to cut on her throat, and was not successful. And then the ordeal was over. They just, they stopped. They quit and went back, jumped in the car and drove back.
Did Mike say? Did he explain her condition? At what point was she fighting against them? Was there any signs of life after that stabbing from the first guy, or did he even say?
I did ask him that later. Mike told me that the original sound he described to me was like somebody striking a watermelon in the chest. That was how hard the blows were into her chest. He also described to me the feeling of the knife on her throat in a later conversation was rubbery and, textury and something he had not expected, and described to me what the body was doing is bubbling the last breaths of air that were occurring as he was putting the knife to her neck.
So the other thing I want to explain is, what was the point of the passing of the knife from guy 1 to guy 2 to guy 3? I mean, do you want to cover that, or do you want me to?
Well, it's 2 guys can keep a secret or 3 can secret. If all of them are dead but one. So it's better to get everybody dirty in the same crime to keep everybody honest in this trio of criminals.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's pretty common with that, not only that club, but other clubs is this, anytime there's more than one person, they all got to basically bite their piece off. And so when you're handed that knife, that's the expectations. You're going to participate. And if you don't participate, especially in something like that, I mean, there's probably a good potential that you're going to be the next one stabbed. Because they're going to take that as, okay, you've just told me that you're going to run to the cops with this because you're not participating.
Right.
So instead of that, we'll just go ahead and kill you here with this other person.
Yep, exactly.
So, I mean, it's a serious, serious deal. It's not, and I guess I really want to make sure that it doesn't sound like I'm saying he had to do it, because I never want to say that someone has to participate in something, especially that gruesome. But at the same time, he probably felt a massive amount of pressure to do something.
Well, he did. He felt pressure to do what he described to me as he did. He also told me later that he felt had these two not been prospects, had they been full-fledged members, that wouldn't have occurred. They would have stripped her naked and just, or maybe just left her there, to walk home. He thought that these prospects were trying to impress him, and so there was that component in this deed that was unexpected and very unfortunate. But anyway, they left her in the desert and drove home and drove back to the clubhouse, and each got in their own vehicles or their own motorcycles and went to their respective homes to deal with whatever they took away mentally from this.
Did you at any point, and I may be jumping ahead, but did you ever get the impression, or did he say anything that it was meant to be something more than a drop-off? Like, did the club tell those prospects, basically take her out there and kill her? Or did they almost give the impression that, no, just take her, do a drop-off, leave her out there, and then, like you're saying, did they take it upon themselves to kill this gal to further their view in the club's eyes?
Based on my conversation with Mike, it was never a club-sanctioned, organized Hell's Angel decision to do what occurred.
And that's what I thought.
And if I remember this correctly, too, that there weren't even that many people in the clubhouse. So it's not like being in a bar where there's 50 people in this bar. You have to understand most of these clubhouses are in a residence that have really pissed off neighbors next to it, because they come in and they buy a house and then they turn it into their clubhouse, or where they hold church.
Right.
And so it would have been a real small structure, probably no more than, I think that, if I remember right, it's probably 1,500 square feet in the house, maybe 1,800. So it was relatively small, and I don't think there were many people there that night.
Sure. So they commit this homicide. They leave her out there. They all go back to the club, jump on their bike or car, head back home, and then where does it go from there?
Well, I went home. After he told me what had occurred, I drove home, wishing I had never answered Mike's call initially, because I had been drugged back into a really ugly, dirty scene that my curiosity factor had put me in a position where I was glad. I felt compelled to move forward with this thing. I would never abandon the project at that point to either recover the woman or solve this crime if she had already been recovered. But I had a long ride home, and I didn't sleep just because I felt quite dirty, inside, having just had this man who had held the knife to another woman's head have this conversation with me. So I went home and had to process a lot, and I'm not sure what they had done, but it became obvious that Mike, I convinced Mike, we had a conversation before I left, that he was considering fleeing, running away, because he didn't think he was really going to go through with this ATF cooperation business. And I told him that he couldn't flee his conscience, and obviously he was bothered by it enough to call me. So I convinced him that probably the right thing to do would be to just stay the course.
Yeah, follow through
with what he was doing, no matter what happened at this point. The cat was out of the bag. But I was in a position where I felt extreme exposure at that point from the Hells Angel and the organization, because having had this man confess the things to me that had just occurred. So I had some things to process and work out too.
I'll bet. Did you, one of the first things that pops into my head is, did you feel obligated? Did you feel like, because of what you used to do and kind of the position you're in now, did you almost feel like I have to do this regardless? I feel obligated?
100%.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even because of the professional obligation. It was this moral obligation, that even had I not been a cop and somebody had been telling me these things, we had a woman that was murdered brutally, and I had a man telling me he was there when it occurred and participated to the degree he was confessing to. So I had this moral obligation to see this through and make sure that I passed him off and kept pumping him up to continue to work with law enforcement, once they got into bed with one another, because he changed his mind repeatedly over the course of their relationship and would always come back to me. But it was kind of a no-brainer to me. I had put myself in that position, so
yeah,
and I was going to see it through.
Yeah, and I guess that's where I was leading with it. It's almost, you really didn't have a choice.
I didn't.
I mean, you had between, again, you can say however strongly or not strongly the law enforcement thing was, it was a moral obligation. I mean,
right.
Just as a good person, you had to see it through.
Yeah. I mean, I think 9 out of 10 people would have followed through and done what they could to make sure this was resolved and solved.
I don't know. I think you're a little high.
All right.
Well, because I look at it as the average person is probably quite fearful of crossing the Hell's Angels.
They are, and they have a reason to be, but I know my makeup is that I couldn't sleep.
Oh, you wouldn't have been able to do it? Yeah. You couldn't walk away.
I couldn't have functioned in any part of my life unless I made sure that this was fixed.
Properly taken care of.
We couldn't bring Cynthia back to life, but I just need to. And at this point, we didn't even know if she'd been recovered. I didn't know. I had not heard of a body being recovered in that area. And he had given me enough information on where the body was that I was able to actually drive out and take pictures of where this occurred or where the body was at.
So you took pictures of the actual body itself?
No, not of the body.
Just where it was?
Geographically, right. The body had been recovered.
Gotcha.
It had recovered. But the next day, I got a call from the Phoenix or the Tempe sergeant asking me, they were pretty convinced that he might have spilled the beans to me when I took him home. And they asked me, Chuck asked me if he had told me what occurred, and I told Chuck he had, and he asked me what he had told him, and I refused to tell him until I processed a proper way to divulge this information.
Right.
And he said that, ultimately I could be subpoenaed. I said, well, I could, but I think there's another way around this.
Well, yeah, give me a couple minutes here, big deal. So, yeah, I could.
Yeah.
I could see that. So you go out there, you essentially geographically, you're like, yep, this is the area. And you get the call from Tempe and they tell you, you have that conversation. Where do things go from there?
I didn't go out to that area until several days later.
Okay.
So I put that in wrong sequential order here. So ultimately, I crafted a document that if A and B and C do this and D does this and A and B and C, without naming any names or giving much detail, is that a workable solution where ATF will still work with Mike Kramer? And presented that document to law enforcement, and they got the go-ahead. They shared it amongst the ATF guys, and they said, that's fine, we'll still work with this guy. So ultimately, I put Mike together with the gang guys from Arizona and Tempe, and they got together with ATF, and they rolled that relationship into a cooperating relationship where Mike was relocated in another state. He worked in Arizona for a while, and then he was taken out of state to Southern California and worked on behalf of ATF, giving them information about whatever crimes they were investigating attached or involving the Hells Angels organization.
So, and you kind of backed out of it completely at that point?
I backed out of all contact with law enforcement except for a few conversations I had with some guys in law enforcement that were working this case where I argued with them over the fact that the other two guys had still been left in the wind. The other two individuals, the two prospects that had murdered Cynthia with Mike, they were just going about their daily life. And I had concerns that we have three people involved in this crime. One of them is cooperating in law enforcement, so I assumed he was under pretty tight control since this case was so noteworthy. It was a big case for them. But the other two were just left to ride their motorcycles and go about their daily activity. I was concerned that they might kill somebody else.
Sure. Well, so I guess the question is, what was the holdup? Why were they still out there? I mean, why was the case taking so long?
Well, it was kind of like the ends justify the means, so this is an opportunity that is never presented to us. So you go away, Jay. You're no longer in law enforcement. Thank you for doing what you've done. And I was pretty much cut out of the law enforcement loop at that point, and the only information that would come to me, the only information I gathered about what was occurring was being told to me by Mike, who would come to town. He still had a family in town. He was married. He had a child.
Oh, jeez.
So he would still come to town to see his family. And when he would come to town, he would always reach out to me. And we'd either by telephone or in person, he would catch me up to speed with what was going on.
Again, like I said, my involvement with the case is pretty limited. The only thing that I recall, because it was probably around the time that you passed everything off, was we'd be given little tasks or chores of things to do, like go check on this person or go check this address or get a plate off of that car at this time, or, little snippets that I later found were related to the case. But obviously a case that's at that kind of importance, and, they're kept pretty secret and tight to the chest. I don't think I even learned that you had been involved in until years later. As far as we knew, it was just this homicide investigation, blah, blah, blah. But
yeah, and I probably wouldn't be sharing this with you now, Kevin, had I not been outed by ATF and an international outlaw motorcycle organization several years ago, where they presented me an award for participation here without sharing with the world everything I'd done, while they honored and recognized, a bunch of other people that were involved in this case. So, no, this case in Tempe was guarded so closely that not even the intel guy in Tempe that was responsible for knowing this, because I inadvertently said something one day after I was told by a sergeant that the body had been recovered prior to Mike even coming to me, but they had matched up the information that Mike had provided to me, and he had subsequently provided to law enforcement, that the manner of death and the area where this woman had been recovered from, they had matched the crime and the recovered body to the actual criminals that had done this.
So I guess just back to, the ends justify the means. It's a twisted way to put it, but I think you're exactly right. So at what point did anything ever happen?
Well, this went on for years. Mike wanted to stop, flee. He would get scared. He would think he was being treated poorly by ATF. ATF, I understand, was paying him a lot of money, too, by this point. I don't know how much, but I think the amounts came out in some trials in California and Arizona and some federal cases.
But they're paying him for things that are not related to this murder of Cynthia,
exactly.
Correct? So this is things that have gone, again, this is the ends justify the means. So they'd almost moved past this homicide.
They moved completely by this homicide, and we're now actively pursuing other threads, other spokes of the wheel.
Sure.
In
the giant
in the
HA wheel.
Right. So no, they had moved way beyond it, and we're subsidizing Mike. They set him up with an apartment, I think, in San Diego. He was traveling all around the country at their request. And I will say, too, I mean, every time I saw him, his condition was getting worse physically. You could tell he was using. His wife complained to me several times about how much meth he was using and how bad he was doing, yet he was running pretty hard.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I hate to come back to again, I mean, did anybody get arrested?
They did. They got arrested. I don't know the final numbers. You could probably Google your way to this period of time and find out, because the feds love to name their investigation. So I forget what they even named this one, and I couldn't say it anyway. I read the plaque and I couldn't read it. But there were several other investigations going on that they had some pretty specific, nationally known names that were occurring. And at some point, it was coming to a phase, nearing completion. You run the risk of exposure, or you've got enough dirt on enough people that you feel like you've wrapped up your case sufficiently. And about that time, I remember Mike calling me to tell me that somebody in the organization had found a camera and a lamp in his apartment in San Diego, or the house in San Diego. I mean, his house of cards was
it's the end of that.
So, that was the end of that.
Wow. So since then, since that all occurred, any more dealings with Mike?
When everything was collapsing in his world, I knew by this point the federal government was going to put him in WITSAC. They were going to put him in the Witness Protection Program. There was so much going on that I remember getting a call from Mike from Las Vegas one time begging me to go over to his house and get his motorcycle and take it back to my house, because the Hells Angel, it was just a matter of time when the Arizona members of the HA were going to go knocking on his wife's door and repossess everything with an HA signature on it,
right,
or insignia on it. He said nobody would help him. Law enforcement wouldn't help him. The ATF wouldn't help him. Local guys wouldn't help him. I think he was even with Chuck, in Vegas at the time when I got this call.
Wow.
So he begged me loud enough that I go, what the hell? I'll go over and get his motorcycle. So I actually had my wife drive me over to another part of his house, parked down the block. I walked in, jumped on this HA motorcycle, Mike's motorcycle, and I rode it back to my house. I hid it there for months till he asked me to sell it for him. I put it up on, remember Auto Trader?
I do.
So I put a picture of it on Auto Trader, and I no sooner posted that thing on Auto Trader and my phone started ringing with guys that have voices much worse than mine. The first call, I said I sold the bike. Then I pulled the ad down, and I waited another 6 months before I put it back up on there, and then I had a couple women call me, and they wanted to come out and look at it. And I actually invited them out to my house to look at it, opened up the door, and had a bad feeling immediately when I looked at these women who were here to see this motorcycle.
Right.
So it turns out that they were actually wives or girlfriends of members of the HA. They assured the club that the motorcycle had been bought by me and they couldn't effectively come in and repossess it. And that information came back to me because Mike was still in the telephone chain somehow, and he had people call me saying, "Hey, whoever was at your door, they were it was something." He gave me the names of the members, but I don't remember them now.
But they're with the club.
They were with the club.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So bring this kind of back around. So do you feel like Cynthia got justice? I guess that would be the question if I was an outsider looking into this.
Well, the other two guys that were with Mike when the prospects when this occurred, they were both arrested, and then they were both released pending their trial. And one of them had actually cut off, I think, an ankle monitor, and he fled the country. And only recently, and I say recently, in a matter of the last maybe 3 or 4 years, I think it was found like 5 or 6 years ago in Argentina.
I was going to say South America.
Yeah, he was in Argentina, but there were some extradition issues, so he fought extradition, and he stayed down there for 3 or 4 years fighting extradition, and they eventually got him back. So both those guys have been convicted. Mike is in the witness protection program. Still. Well, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know.
Yeah,
I have no way to contact him. So he's got a new identity somewhere.
Until he reaches out to you again.
And he did for a while.
Yeah.
He did for a while. But usually when I got a call from him, he was lonely, and he would call me. He would get on a motorcycle and drive 400 miles, find a payphone, and call me with a calling card. And he had a distinctive voice. And when I'd pick up the phone, he would just chuckle that he was having another conversation with me. That went on for about a year or so, and then he fell away, and that's fine. He's probably better. There's no contact.
So we have no idea what or where, or if Mike's even still around right now.
Right, correct.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Very interesting case. And again, I remembered working on little bits and pieces, not even knowing what the case was back then, but now, obviously getting information from you and from other people at the PD. But was there anything else that I guess stuck out to you that you were, unhappy with or thought could have gone better or wish that you had done or anything at all?
Well, I don't think there's anything I wished I would have done different. As bad and as ugly as an experience as parts of it was, I'm glad that my involvement led to the arrest and conviction and solving of Cynthia's murder. So for that part, I'm glad. I was angry at first that Tempe didn't handle this on their own and why they wanted to pass the baton to ATF, because I never wanted to give anything away when I was, in working special investigations. So you just, you feel like you're capable of doing everything. But looking back, that was the right decision to do. The part that I'll probably never understand and agree with was, it's one thing to leave your star informant out, to operate in this world, but not to arrest the other two guys that was with him. And had they arrested him, I understand that would have negated Mike's cooperation and his ability to function in the organization as an informant for them. But I still think that it was too much risk to assume to get a better case on the Hells Angel organization, letting these three men, operate in the world, not,
live their lives.
They live their lives. Those two guys, that were arrested and fled. They weren't arrested for quite some time, and their arrest didn't come until the big organization, the big cases came down that were being worked, on the national level.
Right.
So I'll probably never agree with that, because I just think that was too risky of a decision, and I thought that was too cavalier. I have a hard time swallowing that one.
Sticks in your throat.
It does.
Yeah, and I mean, I the easiest way for me is you equate that with, we chase these dope dealers, and you say, okay, we're gonna drop charges on this one to roll on the person above him, and we're gonna drop charges on that one to roll to the person above them. And people say, well, why do you do that? Why don't you arrest everybody? And we justify it, we argue it, and I'm sure that people that were working this case have their justification and their reasoning for, continuing to chase other fish and bigger fish, et cetera. But, it's like where's the line drawn between, okay, drug sales is drug sales, but a dead person is a dead person. So it's like, how do you differentiate? Where's the line?
I think with a heartbeat, when the heart starts beating, when you murder, I think the line is pretty defined. In that case, I don't think you're justified, and I wouldn't be the type of guy that felt it was justified to let these two men, the third man I've got in my hip pocket, and I'm controlling to some extent.
Right.
Obviously not to great extent, because he had a hell of a drug problem. And so I just find, like you said, I can't stomach it. And I think the line is, when you take a life, you probably shouldn't let those that took that life live their lives for years and years and years. We don't know what they did. To this day, we don't know what they did from that night in the desert outside of Phoenix till the time they were arrested.
Yeah, and you already know they're capable of murder, cold-blooded murder.
Brutal.
So, yeah, we'll never know. We'll never know. I mean, crooks don't typically fess up on crimes unless they're pressed to fess up on something. So they're not going to just come out and say, "Oh yeah, by the way, I did X, Y, and Z."
And normally they'll never confess to a murder.
Right. Well, especially those kind of people.
Exactly.
Oh yeah, they'll never give it. Yeah, deny to the grave.
Some of those crimes are kind of a bragging point. They love that. But a murder, they're probably not going to confess that. Not to a cop anyway. They confess to each other.
Oh yeah. Interesting. Yeah, this was a good one. I'm glad that we did this one. It's a great story, and you filled in a lot of the holes, some of the things that I'd forgotten or some of the things I didn't even know. Pretty unique. I mean, again, you and I have done a lot of unique things in law enforcement. I mean, when you look at something like this, being in the position that you were in with an old CI reaching out to you and you're retired. I mean, again, unheard of is the only thing I can think of. You would expect this to be a movie.
It was
something that came out of a movie.
Very, very unusual. Very unique. Unique is a good way to describe it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it speaks to your ability to get in with a CI for sure and befriend them enough to where they trust you to come back like that. It's pretty crazy.
I'm glad he felt the trust to come back to me.
Yeah.
Otherwise that crime would have gone unsolved.
Yeah, easily could have. Who would have ever known? Because again, those folks aren't the kind of people that talk to anybody in law enforcement.
Right.
So, anyway.
Yep.
I think that's about it. Do you have anything else you want to add? Or
no, I think we covered it.
That was a good episode. I appreciate your time again on that one. Hopefully Cynthia's family is doing okay and they've come to grips with all this mess. And
I hope so.
You feel for those folks.
I do. I mean, it was a long time ago, but I'm sure somebody in that family is still hurting. So.
Sure, absolutely. You never get over it completely.
Nope.
All right, guys. Well, with that, I'm going to close this episode of I Barely Got Here. I want to thank you all for listening, and if you like the show, please subscribe and post a review, and ask your friends to give it a listen. If you have any questions or comments, you can always shoot me an email at ibarelygodhere@gmail.com, and you can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. And with that, Sam42
and King 410.
We are 10-7. Take care.